Well, thanks everybody for joining us today and braving the elements to come here. And thanks all of you watching online or on YouTube for joining us today. Justice Scalia once said in describing administrative law that administrative law is not for sissies. So grab hold of both sides of your chair and get ready for a challenging conversation. And so I appreciate you all coming here today, because it's easy for a lawyer like me to speak in platitudes about how the administrative state operates or how it's supposed to operate. The real challenge is grappling with the actual reality of government, the facts, and not just the rhetoric, and actually analyzing the real impacts of regulation on day-to-day life and trying to quantify that and analyze that. And so it's a real pleasure to bring this group together today. In terms of platitudes, when I teach administrative law, I often like to begin with a quote from Chief Justice Roberts from 2012 in a case called City of Arlington versus FCC, where the chief said, "The administrative state wields vast power and touches almost every aspect of daily life. The framers could hardly have envisioned today's vast and varied federal bureaucracy and the authority that administrative agencies now hold over our economic, social, and political activities. The administrative state, with its reams of regulations, would leave them rubbing their eyes." It's a great line, great rhetoric, but the question is, how do we actually quantify those impacts? How serious are the burdens that Chief Justice Roberts is just generally alluding to? And I can't think of three better people to delve into this, given their individual work and the collective work of the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which I'm a big fan of. And so it's a real pleasure to bring these three together. Let me introduce them briefly, and then we'll kick off a discussion. And there will be opportunity for question and answers. There'll be microphones, so please think of good questions. Our first speaker today, to my right, is Patrick McLaughlin. Patrick is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, where he directs its program for economic research on regulation. His research focuses primarily on regulations and the regulatory process. He co-founded and leads the Regdata and QuantGov team at Mercatus, which we'll talk about a lot today. That team has developed machine learning methods to quantify the impacts of regulations and other legal texts. He's written many peer-reviewed articles, testified before Congress and state legislatures, and appeared in a variety of media outlets. Prior to joining Mercatus, he served as a senior economist for the Federal Railroad Administration in the U.S. Department of Transportation. Sitting next to him is Hester Pierce. Hester is a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center and director of its Financial Markets Working Group. Her primary research interests relate to the regulation of financial markets. She previously served on the Republican staff for the Senate Banking Committee as it responded to the 2008 financial crisis and implementation of the Dodd-Frank laws. She was a staff attorney at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and now she also serves on the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee. And then finally, we're joined by Bentley Coffey. He's a visiting assistant professor at Duke University and assistant research professor at the University of South Carolina. His broad research interests span three areas: energy and the environment, factors that stimulate growth, like competition and innovation, and factors that reinforce poverty, such as discrimination, discounting, and risk. Before joining the University of South Carolina, he was an assistant professor at Clemson University and then served as a senior economist at the Cadmus Group, an environmental consulting firm. He holds a PhD from Duke University, and in 2016, they've all written a number of papers, but one in particular that I'd like to focus your attention on. In 2016, Bentley and Patrick co-authored Mercatus's white paper on the cumulative cost of regulations. So before we delve into Regdata and the QuantGov project, which is really exciting and fascinating, I do want to set the stage by taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of the cost of regulation. And Hester, if you don't mind, I'll start with you, because being both a lawyer and an economist, you see this from both perspectives, and you know as well as anybody that cost-benefit analysis is at least nominally a part of the modern administrative state, right? In the White House and the agencies themselves, and somewhat in Congress and in the courts, we're supposed to be looking at the costs and benefits of regulation. Could you just explain how that works now and to what extent you think it actually is working the way it's intended?
Yeah, I should start by telling people that I'm actually not an economist. I'm a would-be economist without the ability to do the math. So, but I do think about things through an economic lens because I was an economics undergrad, and that I think changes the way you view the world. Unfortunately, for regulators, it's not really the way they view the world. They don't really think about the fact that if you spend resources on one thing, you can't spend them on something else. And they don't think about the goal of trying to make regulations as effective as you can, but also thinking about the costs it's going to have and the unintended consequences it's going to have. So the goal of regulatory impact analysis is to get agencies to think about things that they might not otherwise think about. Now, I come out of financial regulation, so a lot of that work is done by independent regulatory agencies, which actually are not under, most of them are not under a statutory requirement, or they're not under the requirements of executive orders to do regulatory impact analysis. So you sort of have two tracks. One is the executive branch agencies, which are doing regulatory impact analysis. And work that Mercatus has done has shown that it's not perfect by any means, that there's a lot of room for improvement. Some agencies do a better job than others. And then the independent regulatory agencies are not required to do it by executive order. Their work is not reviewed by the OIRA at the Office of Management and Budget if they do analysis. And so you have a very different level of quality. So for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I come from, actually did have a statutory requirement to do some sort of economic analysis and plugged along for years, not doing a very good job. Asking lawyers like me to do an economic analysis is not a wise idea. And so then eventually, people decided to take them to court over their poor economic analysis. And that actually, as one of our colleagues at Mercatus has looked at the result of that and found that actually it brings the SEC up quite a bit. Having been sued over their economic analysis sort of focused the mind, and so they do a better job. But what I always like to tell agencies is don't think of this as a penalty that you have to do economic analysis. It's a tool. It's a tool for you to think through what the problem is you're trying to solve, then think about whether a regulatory solution is the appropriate solution or not. Think about the different alternatives. And then you build in metrics at the beginning so that you can go back later and say, hey, is this working the way that we thought it should be working? And so I think that there's real potential for agencies to embrace this and stop viewing it as a burden and really try to use it for real purpose. And some of the work that we're going to talk about today, I think, helps agencies to see the importance of this project, because regulation just piles up over time and really can have an effect on growth, which I think these guys are going to talk about. So
just to unpack that a little bit, you said there are some statutes, a few statutes, that in certain instances require agencies to do cost-benefit analysis. The more commonly, the so-called executive branch agencies like the EPA do it because the White House has executive orders that require them to do it. But those orders, they're not judicially enforceable, right? They don't create judicially enforceable rights. It's just the White House monitoring its own agencies. The new administration has redoubled that with a few other executive orders imposing a regulatory budget that based on the cost of regulation and other things like that. But it's sort of a patchwork of requirements. And when you talk about the SEC having lawyers do cost-benefit analysis, and one example I like to think of is in 2011, the CFTC Inspector General published a report really blasting that agency for doing bad cost-benefit analysis. And if I remember correctly, they said that the cost-benefit analysis in that agency was treated as the caboose, was their word. Right, yeah. The caboose that follows the rest of the work and was basically done by lawyers.
And that was exactly my experience at the SEC. Yeah. I mean, we didn't call it the caboose, we called it, I think, the end matter or something along the same lines. But, you know, it really was driven by what does the rule say, and then you craft your economic analysis to support the rule. And I mean, that's what happens with the check-the-box mentality.
Yeah. Now, one last question before we shift to Bentley and Patrick. I mean, having been in an agency, and I mean, the SEC is pretty well regarded. I mean, it's not a backwater. It's a serious agency full of serious people. Just in your general perspective, what would be the right mindset for regulators, the right mindset and the right base of facts that they would need to do good cost-benefit analysis in the regulatory context?
I mean, I think the primary mindset to have is curiosity. So trying to get as much information as you can, trying to lay out for people what assumptions you're making so that people can respond and say, no, that's not the right assumption, you shouldn't make that assumption. I'm just trying to think down the road what the follow-on effects of what you're doing can be, and then also think about how it relates to other things that you might be doing as an agency. But I mean, as I said, the SEC really has improved, and they've put quite a bit of time and effort and human resources into the problem of doing economic analysis. You have to integrate it. I mean, to your point about the caboose, you really have to integrate it at the beginning of the process. Otherwise, you might as well not do it. It's meaningless.
And the paper, by the way, that you were referring to by Jerry Ellig, it just came out a few months ago, your colleague at the Mercatus Center. And just to spell it out, because I think it's a terrific paper, it's a paper that looked at the quality of the SEC's cost-benefit analyses after it lost that big DC Circuit case in about 2011. And Jerry's findings were that, I mean, how would you put it, the new cost-benefit analyses are more detailed, more rigorous, more sort of expansive than the pre-DC Circuit decision cost-benefit analysis.
He looks at a number of different metrics to see how well it's doing. And essentially, that experience brought the SEC up to the level of executive branch agencies who get OIRA review, and the SEC still doesn't get that. So still work to go, still room for improvement, but definitely has helped.
Okay, well, in terms of the actual facts of cost-benefit analysis, and we have two great economists today, Patrick and Bentley, to talk about this, but one of the really, what I find really interesting and exciting projects in Mercatus right now is Regdata and then QuantGov. QuantGov building on Regdata or expanding. But why don't you tell us what the Regdata project is, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, take a little trip down memory lane here for Regdata. It's a project we've been working on at Mercatus for quite some time, but actually the origin goes even farther back. I went to grad school at Clemson University, and Bentley was actually on my committee when I was doing my dissertation back then. And we discussed, even clear back then, some of the concepts and the ideas that later on I ultimately built Regdata to help solve. Hester was describing a lot of what we think we know in terms of the regulatory impact of individual rules when there is sometimes an analysis done by an agency, and even in the best of worlds where that analysis is done as well as you could possibly hope for given what the executive order asks of the agencies or the statutes and the special cases. Even then, there's still a lot we don't know about that regulation or that regulation's effect on the economy.
I mean, just in terms of, in that process, when an agency is doing its regulatory impact analysis, they're basically bringing in facts from their own body of experts within the agency and then public comments, basically shoveling factual allegations at them in terms of economic studies. And the agency kind of parses through them and finds facts in a way, but it's not a very rigorous process.
It can be rigorous, but it's still limited in a lot of ways, mostly just because they work in time constraints and have limited amount of resources they can devote to these. But the analyses they do will always be only focused on that single rule and the effects of that rule. But the fact is, as Hester mentioned, these rules that are created by agencies have been piling up for years and years and years, and they often interact with each other. And so that's one effect, for example, that we couldn't ever understand by just looking at the publications that come out of agencies in forms of regulatory impact assessments. And that was one of the things that Bentley and I were discussing many years ago back in grad school. So what is the effect of all these rules piling up one on top of the other? And is there interaction effects that we're missing? Is there an effect on the dynamism of the economy that we're missing? That's another aspect that's not included in these analyses. They'll look at typically things like compliance costs, add those up, but there's going to be a dynamic effect. The economy might become less competitive. There might be less new business formations because of the buildup of rules. So that was sort of the origin of Regdata, wanting to understand what are the dynamic effects of regulatory accumulation on the economy. And later on, when I finished grad school and got up here to DC, started to think about, okay, how do we actually solve this? How can we understand the dynamic effects of regulation, regulatory accumulation? And it starts with measurement. It's like like most science.
Right.
So Regdata was built to solve this problem too. The problem was we didn't know how much regulation there was. We didn't know how much there was at different points in time. We didn't know how regulated different industries were at different points in time. We wanted to know, especially across industries, how regulated they were, because that really lets us compare some more regulated industries to some less regulated industries, and that can help identify the effect of being more regulated or less regulated on the industry's growth rate, or the innovation that comes out of it. So Regdata, it's a computer program, basically. It's a bunch of computer programs that will read regulatory text for me, because I'm not going to spend 3 years of my life reading it. That's what it would take if you wanted to read through all current regulations right now, just at the federal level. And it turns that into data. The data that comes out of these computer programs can then be used in analysis, like the paper you mentioned that Bentley and I put out last year.
The cumulative impacts paper?
Yeah, the cumulative cost of regulations paper. But I should clarify one thing. I think you said, and others have said this too, and maybe it's in my bio on Mercatus' website, but Regdata, I think you said Regdata will read regulations and tell you things about the regulatory burden of those regulations. But in fact, it's just telling you how much regulation there is.
Okay.
It's a measurement of the quantity of regulation at different points in time on different industries, and who it's coming from as well, which agencies are producing it. So let me go into a little bit into the details of what I mean, like what are the data that you could get if you went to regdata.org and downloaded the data set.
Yeah.
The quantity of regulations, what is a regulation in the first place? What are we looking at? Regulation is pretty poorly defined as a unit. Mm-hmm. So we have defined what a unit of analysis is, and that is, if anyone's ever read any regulations, they go in the Code of Federal Regulations when they're turned into law, when they go on the books. And within the Code of Federal Regulations, it's divided up into different chapters, titles, parts, legal divisions of text. And so we created a unit of analysis where we determined that we'll analyze parts, the legal term, part. So every part has a bunch of data associated with it. The data will tell you how many words, simple stuff like word counts, a little bit more complex stuff like restriction counts. Restrictions are our lawyers' favorite words, the shalls and the musts, the words that create binding obligations or prohibitions. That if you don't do them, you'll be breaking the law. So we have restriction counts, and then we have the most complex part, the industry relevance. I said earlier we want to know how regulated different industries are. So our programs will read all these different parts of regulatory text, and we have a set of machine learning algorithms that we've built that has learned how to identify when text is talking about specific industries. Mm-hmm. And so with that, we estimate the probability that the text is talking about all the different industries in the economy as defined by the North American Industry Classification System. That has a lot of nice features because, Bentley will probably mention this, a lot of the data that you can use in economic analysis is also divided up according to the same system. So industry is defined by that system. Lets you put it all together and do the analysis that lets you get to the burden estimates, not just the quantity estimates. So that's Regdata in a nutshell. Regdata, as you mentioned, led to QuantGov, and actually if I went and did it now, I would do it the other way around. QuantGov is sort of it's a more generalized approach to turning text into data, turning policy relevant text into data. We realized later on after we built Regdata that this could be used in a lot of other scenarios. Regdata was built for federal regulation specifically, but once we backed up and made a more generalized approach, we were able to use the same programs on things like state regulations. We're looking at trade agreements right now to see if there's some features within trade agreements that might indicate some agreements actually have regulations buried in them, and that could have an effect on their effectiveness. We're looking at other countries' regulations to be able to compare, for example, Canada, how Canada has proceeded with its regulatory reform efforts and see how that's affected their economy relative to what we're doing in addressing regulation. We're looking at provinces in Canada. We're able to look at executive actions, executive orders, and pull data out of that. we have a lot going on with QuantGov, and probably the most important thing I should mention here is all those data sets are freely available to the public. You can go download them, use them in your own research, or make graphs out of them, whatever you want. You can also get the programs themselves, if anyone's inclined to do so. It's all written in Python if you have any background in computer programming or willing to learn. Python's a relatively easy language to learn, by the way. So we've made all our programs open source, and you can get those and build on what we've done. So if you wanted to, for example, pull out other words than what we pull out, the restrictions that we identify, you can easily change and identify other words in text by just modifying one line in the programs. So we classify text according to which industry we think the text is about. You could change that too if you wanted to and classify over a different set of topics. So there's a lot of flexibility that's built into the programs themselves, and that's all available.
Well, just to put it in more concrete terms, I mean, Bentley, given your background as an academic economist, but also in your consulting experience, energy and environment especially, how would people either in academia or in the private sector, use the data that comes out of Regdata? What are sort of the beneficial uses of the output of Regdata?
So you can think about what's come out of Regdata is a measure. Patrick described it a moment ago. So economists, we've had readily available for a long time measures about taxes. So we know a ton about taxes. We know about what the deadweight losses look like for a tax and how to estimate that, and sort of what are the immediate effects versus what are the long-run dynamic effects. And all of that analysis that's been done over taxes over the last 50 or so years was enabled by having quantitative data. And we didn't have the same sort of analysis of regulations because we didn't have quantitative data on regulations. So now with Regdata, we have these measures which, in some sense, perhaps aren't as refined as measures that you have for taxes, right? Like, it's easy to see what a tax rate is. There's a number that you can look up, right? But there's no one number to look up. So instead, we've got sort of the best available what we can do with Regdata. So we've got these measures of constraints, and we've got some probability that these constraints apply to particular industries. So now that we have that, we can then say, okay, what are the outcomes of interest that we can pair that data with, right? So,
what do you mean by that? The outcomes of interest?
Right. So going back to the discussions that Patrick and I had as far back as graduate school, we were thinking, okay, so if regulations are imposing some sort of restrictions or constraints on private sector firms, then it must be that it affects their behavior. It causes them to make different decisions than they would otherwise. That's what the regulations would have to do in order for those constraints to bind. And
it's sort of definitional, right? Regulations are designed to change behavior.
And if firms exist to maximize their profits, then changing their decisions must mean that they have a drop in profits. To the extent that profit making is sort of the motivation that has caused so much of our growth and our innovation, then there must be some cost associated with these regulations, not just in terms of some immediate drop in firm profits, but also some long-run real drop in growth of the economy. And so we're like, wow, we should be able to find measures for economic performance. Those are standard things that economists carry around, right? That you have government agencies, BEA, BLS, that generate this sort of data that people in the Fed, are monkeying with every day. And so if you take these as outcomes, you say, okay, we're interested in how much the economy grew and how much these various sectors of the economy grew, and what were the conditions that were more conducive or less conducive to growth. then we can include regulation in those sort of basket of things of interest to say, okay, so here we have some measure of change in regulation. What was the corresponding change that you get in growth that we might be able to associate those things together?
So you can bring it all the way out to a projected dollar outcome, basically.
Right. So the idea is, informally, we know, or intuitively we know that regulation has some effect on economic performance, but we hadn't been able to do a very good job, quantifying that, right? So when an agency does a cost-benefit analysis, it's attempting to do that. But there's a bunch of things that are very difficult to include in a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that you're doing it, that you're comprehensive. And one of those things, as Patrick mentioned earlier, is interactions with other regulations, right? Yeah. So just complicating the space that these firms are operating in, right, is going to have an effect it's going to have a drag on their performance. And if you just look at a single constraint in isolation, it's not clear that you get the complete picture.
It reminds me of an anecdote, and it's been a few years since it happened, so I'll probably botch one of the details. But I seem to recall around 2011, 2012, then Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke was giving a talk, maybe out in Jackson or something, and he was talking about implementation of the Dodd-Frank statutes. And somebody in the audience, maybe Jamie Dimon from JP Morgan, asked if he had any real sense of the cumulative impacts of all of the Dodd-Frank regulations. I think Bernanke's answer was, no, we don't, and we don't really have the capability for ever figuring that out. So let's just see how this plays out over the next few years. It almost reminded me of Speaker Pelosi's famous line, we have to pass the law to know what's in it. Bernanke was saying, until we really let history play out for a few years, we won't know what the cumulative impacts are. The challenge then, right, for an agency especially, is to get to a point where you don't need to implement a bunch of regulations and then wait for the outcomes. You can at least do some sort of meaningful, reliable projection at the outset of just general, at least orders of magnitude, right? And that's the kind of thing that Regdata, at least in the agencies, might be able to help with, right? Is that an exaggeration?
Well, Regdata, I think, is good at seeing the big picture more than necessarily what an individual rule might do. Yeah. In fact, that's why it was built, because we couldn't read through all the text and figure out those details. But when you're talking about one single rule and you want to know like compliance costs or likely benefits, I think there's no substitute for human eyeballs in that case. On the other hand, like what Bentley was describing was an economic model, right? We want to know how all these different conditions around the sectors of the economy are affecting those sectors' outputs or their growth rates. In that sense, there are big picture models that could be used to better understand how is some big piece of legislation that's going to lead to a bunch of regulations, like Dodd-Frank, for example, likely to affect economic performance. I think in that sort of scenario, we have both the measurement tools and the modeling that could help understand that.
I mean, actually, in the financial space, I mean, this is an agency that you've written about. The Financial Stability Oversight Council brings together all the financial regulators. So that would have been a perfect task for them, which is to kind of look at the big picture. So I hope that they're checking out Patrick's Regdata work on the effective Dodd-Frank, which is the biggest law ever.
I mean, well, another place where the cumulative impact should be most important is probably at the White House's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, right? This is what maybe Cass Sunstein called the cockpit of the administrative state, right? The office in the White House where they're overseeing at least the executive branch agencies and serving as a convener, bringing multiple agencies together when one of those agencies is promulgating a major rule. Right? And so I'm curious, as it happens, President Trump has nominated or is nominating a George Mason University law professor, Naomi Rao, to run that office. I mean, if Naomi or a future OIRA administrator came to you and said, I've heard of Regdata and QuantGov, how could we use it to improve our oversight of the agencies and looking at cumulative impacts? What would you tell them?
Well, so Regdata offers the measurement solution. Then we need the model. And so there's the paper that we wrote has a model. It's it's all spelled out. It's perhaps complex. There's a lot of math there. There's a reason for all that math being there because we wanted to be on sound theoretical grounds. But if they wanted to use that and use Regdata and anticipate the effects, sort of a Regdata style of the executive orders that they're following now.
Yeah. That'd
be one path that I'd suggest. I imagine they may not want to use that model because it's perhaps hard. So I'd say go talk to Bentley because Bentley is a great guy producing other models that are simpler and or complex, whatever you need.
It's true that I'm a math guy. It's the secret is out. But when it comes to learning from data, there's always the question of, well, what's the relevant stuff to include, and how do you include it? And although some researchers may not do it explicitly, implicitly there's always some sort of model kicking around there. And so a model is just our way of describing the world so that we understand it and how the pieces interact to produce outcomes, right? And to some extent, the predictions that you get out of a quantitative analysis or the findings that you can draw are only as good as the model associated with them, right? So you do want to do that carefully. So it's not something that I would ever trust to a machine, right? So Patrick said earlier that there's no substitute for human eyeballs, and there's some element to that in modeling as well. Yeah. But right, you want something relatively simple that could be used by folks in OIRO, that could be transparent enough for everyone on the outside to understand exactly what they're doing. And you could certainly see Regdata being an input to that. And sort of the question is, what are the other inputs and how should those be properly combined? And some of that is going to be a function of the mission of an agency and the direction that you get, from the top.
So you said that Regdata, the data and the program itself, the software, are available to the public. Who so far has been the major uses of what you've put out there? The major users, I mean.
There's been a lot of third-party users, probably that I don't even know about. But some of the simplest uses that we've seen, it's actually pretty amazing. We started producing state-level versions of Regdata recently. And just by putting out graphs or numbers that show how much regulation exists in different states, that's just measurement, right? It's not even the analysis. We aren't saying anything about burden. Just by, if you will, having the states figuratively step on the scale and weigh in and see what they weigh right now, that has led to a lot of interest in regulatory reform at the state legislative levels. So there's users in legislatures, if you will, just looking at quantity across many states. We have users on the research side. Besides Bentley and myself, many other economists have picked up Regdata and used it in their own models and their own analysis. Most recently, there was a Brookings paper that used it for part of its analysis.
What was the Brookings paper about, if you recall?
It was looking at trying to explain the missing productivity growth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Still not much of an answer.
Well, but so Congress is also thinking about regulatory reform. The House has passed bills. The Senate, there's a newly introduced bill by Senators Portman and Heitkamp thinking about across-the-board regulatory reform. Have you managed to pique their interest yet? And if not, what would be sort of your pitch to Congress or the House? The Senate, Homeland Security and Government Oversight Committee to start using this as they think through their own reforms?
Yeah, we've piqued a lot of interest at the federal level in regulatory reform as actually the insights from the cost of regulations paper was really what led to it. I'd say at the federal level, more than just the measurement itself. So unlike at state level, there was maybe a need for a more sophisticated approach at the federal level. Sure. Or maybe it's because at the state level we already had the cost of regulations paper out there and there was sort of a 1-2 punch. But in any case, once we were able to show the results, the effects on economic growth of regulatory accumulation with this study we've mentioned a few times, then there was a lot more interest in regulatory reform, and with reason, right? Especially if you're from a state that's experienced slower growth recently, you're going to try to do anything you can to fix that, or if you're from a state that has issues with its budgets or obligations to pensions or something like that, you might want to pursue whatever means you can to goose growth for that reason too. So it was the cost of regulations paper that was probably the final point that piqued interest. Bentley mentioned that your results as an analyst or as an economist can only be as good as the model, and you were asking about OIRA potentially using Regdata and the model to make predictions. I want to point out that is one of the reasons we built this model that we had in this cumulative cost of regulations paper, so we could do some sort of simulation of what would happen in different scenarios of regulatory growth, regulatory accumulation. So I mention this because there's one scenario that's pretty relevant these days that we did consider in the paper. We said, what would happen if we froze regulatory accumulation? If we held regulations constant at a level that we observed in the year 1980, instead of, so if you were to graph this, it would just be a flat line from 1980 onward for total restrictions, instead of growing consistently from 1980 onward.
And just to interject, you say it's relevant now because the White House has an executive order out that's effectively putting agencies on a regulatory budget that caps that would cap their cumulative costs.
Exactly.
Right. And so what were your findings then?
So what we found was the average growth rate, the annual economic growth rate, would have increased by nearly 1 percentage point. It was 0.8 of 1 percentage point. So that means, instead of 2% growth, we'd have 2.8% growth. It's pretty huge. But then if you consider that this is a growth rate and we have multiple years of growth, and growth is a compounding thing, it's an exponential process, that adds up very quickly. So from 1980 to 2012, that would have grown to be $4 trillion in additional growth that the economy could have experienced. The economy could have been 25% larger than it was in 2012 had we done this alternative policy on regulation.
Just two more questions before we turn it over to the audience. Which one first? I'll say, as of right now, what the machine is looking for are, as you call them, restrictions, the shalls, the musts, the must-nots. So much of regulation now, it seems to be increasingly is mushier than that, right? It's whether it's legalistically moving from binding regulations to guidance, or it's regulatory, what's the word for it? I mean, directives that aren't binding, right? It's more shoulds than shalls. Shoulds, knowing that there's a backdrop of government enforcement that might bring regulatory power to bear on agencies that don't follow the shoulds, but it is phrased differently. I mean,
right.
Do you think going forward there's a way that Regdata and QuantGov will be able to adapt to that sort of more passive-aggressive form of regulation that we're seeing? Sorry.
For sure. The hard part is not having QuantGov, the programs behind Regdata and QuantGov, pull out other language that indicates effective regulation, even if it's not formally regulation. Yeah. You do need to have some human insight to know what words to look for, perhaps, or you could do a purely data-driven approach to see which words actually induce action on the parts of firms, and that might be interesting as well. The harder part is going to be finding all the documents, all the ways in which agencies can regulate or effectively regulate without actually issuing a regulation.
Yeah.
I think you might have told me a story of regulation by Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, agencies are doing more and more, and so if you have a single director agency like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, he can just send out a tweet saying do this and you're going to do it because he's the guy who can decide whether or not there's an enforcement action.
Yeah.
So. And I think you're right to think about the topic. as executive orders make agencies perhaps either have to do more homework or reticent to create new regulations because that might make them have to get rid of other regulations that they like. Yeah. They'll perhaps try to find other ways to accomplish their goals.
Yeah. The other question I had before we turn it over is just looking ahead at what's coming next, because where you're at right now with Regdata and QuantGov, you're a step along years of sort of evolution and progress with this project. What are the next challenges that you see yourself tackling with Regdata and QuantGov?
You want to describe the British Columbia project?
Sure, I can. So Patrick was just describing, imagine the accumulation of regulation over time as a graph, this sort of growing mountain, right? This exponential growth process. And then he said, okay, now consider this hypothetical policy experiment of freezing regulation, so not letting it grow, making it flatline, and sort of what would happen to the economy. And you can compare that to what the economy was doing beforehand versus after, and then you can also compare it, right? So that was a thought experiment, but there's actual real-life policy experiments that go on. So there are places that consider capping the growth in their regulations, and when they take that action and you're able to observe them for a while, you can actually learn directly from places that have done these sorts of experiments. So British Columbia, believe it or not, this province in Canada, took this action. I want to say it started in the early 2000s.
2001.
Yeah. So they reduced their regulations. So doing something like the 2-for-1 swap that the White House has recently prescribed, right, would reduce the overall stock. And then once the stock of regulations got to a point, I want to say it was in like 2004, then they froze it to be flatline thereafter. And so we can look at, okay, this was British Columbia's experience. How did that affect their outcomes? And what about other provinces that didn't take this action? What did their outcomes look like? So what can we learn from this treatment and control groups running these natural policy experiments?
Now, is this in a paper you publish, or is it one that you're working on?
We're working on.
Okay.
Right. I'm sure we will get it out to the public once it's ready. But as you can imagine in research, there's a lot of steps that you have to go through before you reach to a finished product.
We joked beforehand that Michael Kinsley, the famous editor of the New Republic in the 1980s, he once famously said that the most boring newspaper headline he'd ever seen was "Worthwhile Canadian Initiative." This actually is a worthwhile Canadian initiative. It sounds pretty interesting. Langley's here with the microphone. If anybody has any questions to ask, we have a microphone. Please identify yourself before asking your question. And this is being recorded and live streamed.
My name is Joel Hetker, retired government. CAB ended in 1978, Interstate Commerce Commission, 1997. What do you think might be the next agency to bite the dust? That's one question. Yeah. Second, Antitrust Division, 1960s with IBM. At the time, there was Control Data, Honeywell, General Electric, and RCA, which had a very small percentage of the market. Eventually, Amdahl came into being. He left IBM, set up his own mainframe market. Today, Amdahl's gone. I mean, the whole industry completely changed from whatever the government was trying to do in the 60s. Then in the 90s, they went after Microsoft. And I guess that's a little bit more open to question, although I think at one time, Apple only had 14% of the PC market. So, that changed. Obviously, they've increased. So any thoughts on what might be the next regulatory agency to bite the dust?
Reagan once said that the closest thing we have on earth to eternal life is a government program, but it's not, like you said, it's not completely true. Do you want to predict the imminent demise of any federal agencies or bureaus?
The Office of Financial Research might be eliminated soon, which is it's an agency at the Treasury, but it's a self-standing agency that was designed to sort of standardize data collection across financial regulators. and also do research, but it hasn't really won a lot of fans in its 7 years of existence. So I can imagine that one going away.
Yeah.
I wouldn't predict a particular one, but I'd say if it happens, it's not going to be a similar scenario to the late 70s and early 80s, where there's sort of a broad realization of the harm that certain regulatory policies and like civil aeronautics sport policies, price setting was doing to the consumers at large. I think it'd be more of consolidation of agencies that are doing the same thing, have the same mission, covering the same area.
And it may not be even at the agency level. It may be further down, right? So particular offices within agencies get eliminated and its duties shifted over to other offices. You could imagine them doing that to streamline some stuff.
Sure.
But like eliminating a big department like Department of Energy, it took me a while to remember that one. Sorry. You know, just seems not all that realistic with all of the stakeholders.
Yeah, so you could see the Commerce Department losing the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, right, having that go over to the EPA or something. I mean, it's interesting, one of your two examples, the ICC, while the ICC went away, not all of its work did, right? I mean, FERC handles oil pipelines, there's the Surface Transportation Board and all parts of the Department of Transportation. But if it is feasible for the federal government to reorganize itself, at least in some areas, and consolidate redundant or overlapping agencies, that's a place where cumulative impacts for an agency sector would actually be a very important tool as Congress thinks this through, right?
Yeah, I think it follows the same logic very much. You know, part of the thing we were identifying with the study of the cumulative burden of the totality of regulation that's built up is it just becomes really complicated to make any sort of business decision or business investment. And if consolidation leads to less accumulation, then even if the regulations are effectively doing the same thing, but there's fewer of them, I think that would be a positive change.
Hi, Jared Meyer at the Foundation for Government Accountability. I was wondering if you could go into more on Mercatus's work on state-level regulations. So not the paper that looked at the effects of federal regulations on states, but what you've seen in the challenges of trying to estimate state regulatory, even scopes, and then also more on the successes you've had at the states in working with them.
Sure. So we have so far, what we've done in the states is measurement only. We've not taken the next step and done the analysis with the quantifications of regulations in the states. And we've released those quantifications so far for only, I want to say 5 states, but we've got another 6 or so in the queue, and we're chugging through them at a pretty decent clip these days. The biggest challenges have been, frankly, just getting a hold of electronic versions of their regulatory codes, especially if you want to go back in time, if you want historical data. We can get current regulations from most states. New Jersey is a notable exception. You have to go behind a paywall to get New Jersey regulations. I don't know how people who are regulated in New Jersey actually deal with that. But
you're not even allowed to pump your own gas in New Jersey.
Right. But nonetheless, despite not doing the next step analysis, just the way I like to describe what we're seeing in some states when they see their regulatory codes quantified and just compared to other states, and we sometimes will tell a story about British Columbia and what they've done. I call it the when Harry met Sally effect. If you remember the diner scene, and Meg Ryan is acting very happy in the diner scene, and some other diner says, "I'll have what she's having." That's sort of what we're seeing in the states. The governor of Illinois, after seeing how much regulation Illinois had on the books compared to some other states and hearing about British Columbia's recovery after going through regulatory reform, pretty much said, "I'll have what she's having."
And then when looking, because most states aren't doing any sort of cost-benefit analysis or regulatory impact analysis, how then do you pitch the regulatory reform, like figuring out which ones to get rid of accumulated regulations? Is it just random, just pick some, or what? Like, how do you do it without any sort of cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, it's a good point, Jared. We suggest that you do some analysis and try to figure out which rules are actually working and which ones aren't working, first off, and then beyond beyond knowing their effectiveness and creating, the outcomes, the benefits that they're supposed to create, you want to know at what cost. So then, at some point, you can make a more informed and surgical decision on what to eliminate, as opposed to haphazard or random. But it's a lot of work, of course.
Lauren Thompson, the question is, why is it so difficult for agencies to actually reduce their regulatory burden? And of the federal agencies that are over-regulated, what are the factors that cause them to be over-regulated, in your opinion?
Anyone?
So, yeah, if I might take a stab at this one. I think the incentives of very well-intentioned, hardworking people in a bureaucracy are often not quite what you would want them to be by design, right? So I think there's some reward to coming up with a new regulation, saying, here we're protecting the public, and we are having this impact. And I don't think there's the same administrative state sort of reward to, hey, here we are reducing our regulatory burden or streamlining things. It doesn't have, what's the analogy, something like a ribbon cutting. It doesn't have that sort of showy returns to it. I think that's from my experience, one of the larger hang-ups. But it might be different in the financial sector, for instance.
It could have the opposite effect, actually. If you remove a regulation and then something happens 5 years later, they point back to the guy who suggested removing the regulation, and so there's every incentive just to regulate more and say, well, I've been working hard, and not to take the risk of pulling regulations back. But this is the time for Patrick's favorite line about regulators.
Well, yeah, I think you both hit it on the head. It is risk aversion on the one hand, but it is also the incentives of the individual employees who work in these regulatory agencies. The favorite line Hester mentioned: regulators regulate. It's their job. It's what they do, and so it's not that they can't eliminate regulations or reduce burden. It's that they don't have incentive to. Instead, they have incentive to always make more, to create shiny new objects that they can hang their hat on and go and tell Congress about how they're taking actions to make the world safer or cleaner or whatever else is in their mission.
And this is one of the nice features of having a regulatory freeze, because so if I'm somebody who wants to issue new regulations, it forces me to then say, okay, well, what are the old things that maybe aren't working so well that I could retire in order to enable me to pass this new shiny one that I want to. And so in that process, you're incentivizing them to actually evolve towards a more efficient system, at least hopefully.
Hi, Jack McCann with the Charles Koch Foundation. I'm curious to know a little bit more about the accuracy of the data. Where do you think it is right now in just estimating true impact, and kind of where are you in that journey? And then I guess related to that, what are the potential criticisms you might get if the data was used, say, to estimate the cost of federal regulations? What would your opponents or the opponents to that research say about the data? What are your challenges there, if there are any?
Well, on the so there's a couple of different things here. The accuracy of the data. Remember, the data is just quantifying regulation, not estimating the impact of it. That requires the second step, the model and the analysis. As far as counting words go or counting restrictions, there's a small error rate that's always going to occur in these sorts of things. Text has been OCR'd, and there's that sort of error rate, but it's going to be very small. We certainly aren't able to count all restrictions. There's ways in which agencies can create prohibitions or obligations that we're not capturing. But spot checking we've done a lot of, and we have a very high correlation between what a human would come up with and what our programs come up with in terms of measuring restrictions. So in that sense, we're doing very well.
Perhaps you should describe the training documents, the machine learning algorithms.
So then the other part is not counting words, it's estimating the probability that each document is about a specific industry, right, the classifying part. That requires many steps in a machine learning algorithm. We trained this program, this is the machine learning part of it, by having it read a bunch of other documents that use similar language. So regulations go into the Code of Federal Regulations. Agencies also describe what they're doing. They propose new rules in the Federal Register. So that's lucky for us, a source of a bunch of documents that use a similar language, and that's also sometimes labeled with the industries that the regulations will affect. So that way we know, this document's about the railroad industry, and we can feed that to the computer program, have it learn what phrases and words are important for identifying the railroad industry. We have a threshold of accuracy for this that we use to include data or not. There's some industries we don't include because we don't think we're surpassing this accuracy threshold that we've set for releasing the data to the public. That threshold is a 50% increase on what random classification would do. So if you just took a document and randomly said this is about industry X or industry Y, depending on how many industries you're working with, you can expect if it's only 2, you get it right half the time. We want to be at least 50% better than what you would get if you were doing it randomly. So we're doing pretty well as far as accuracy goes in those regards. It's a long answer to your question, which also had multiple parts, because there's also a question about the model. I turn it over to you if you want, Bentley.
Sure. So we've gone from the areas in which we have the most confidence, which is, are we counting up restrictions well, to a little bit less confident of, are we picking out the right industries that this applies to? And Patrick has some roots in West Virginia, and there's this, what was the coal mining example where you talk about a part, right? And you look for what are the words that indicate that this is going to affect the coal industry, and they were just very obvious, clear words that are only used in text that describe coal mining. So we have a fair amount of confidence there. Then when it gets to the modeling, and we're going to say, okay, so if we know this about regulations, how can we associate these regulations with outcomes like changes in growth and cumulative cost of the economy, right? That's when maybe you could say there's a little bit of a bigger leap of faith. But fortunately, academic researchers, we have the scientific method that we rely on, and you produce some research, you follow the scientific method, it enters into the community, people respond to it, right? And they try to improve upon it, they try to test it, kick the tires, and sort of over time, which unfortunately it's a frustratingly slow process, you get acceptance of, we have contributed to the stock of knowledge here, and we know stuff that we didn't. And so in some sense, our paper is somewhat seminal, and it will take a while until you would have something like, scientific consensus on the sort of scientific consensus that we have on costs associated with taxation. It'll be a while until we have that degree of consensus on costs associated with regulation.
It's seminal in the sense that we're using a novel metric of regulation, and even including regulation in a growth model. But on the other hand, the growth model that we're using is accepted and established in the economics community. So there is that to point to. That is a feature of that paper that a lot of other, let's say, estimates of the cumulative burden of regulations may not have.
My name is Sarah Powers. I work for ICF, for a medium-sized consulting firm. I work for a group that provides services to help federal agencies navigate the regulatory process, such as economic analysis. And so I'm very interested in thinking more about how this data might apply to individual, an individual decision making, either at the OIRA level or the agency level. And so I'm wondering if there are certain, and in thinking about the if there's a certain ways for this data to improve upon the estimates of costs of an individual rule or regulation, do you think that there are certain industries for which the understanding of the impact of cumulative regulation on growth and outcomes is better understood than others? And the other thought I had was that, you know, I imagine, I don't know if there's any, you know, models or theory on this, but I imagine that, you know, the cumulative burden of regulation is probably not linear or even, right? There might be some point at which in a specific industry or that there might be kind of a, you know, one regulation, and so maybe it's not possible to model without being more specific, but one regulation might have, you know, cumulatively, considering what this industry is also facing, a, you know, really debilitating effect as compared to the incremental effect of all the regulations that came before. Have you seen any or done any like research about that idea?
There's certainly heterogeneity across industries, rich heterogeneity. And I would say in general, you're going to have more confidence in the effects when you're looking at industries that have been heavily regulated over a very long period of time, right? So for instance, it's hard to make the same sort of statements of confidence about the financial regulations associated with Dodd-Frank, in that, you know, that you have this huge unprecedented takeoff and number of regulations associated with the financial industry that you don't have as very, how do I put this? A clean historical analog than if you're, say, looking at oil and gas regulations that have been, you know, pretty steadily streamed out since the formation of EPA.
So it doesn't help that many financial regulators don't do regulatory impact analysis.
No, it does not.
Was there one other question?
Yes, John Abbey for Bluestein Group. When you look at the front-end models and the assumptions that goes into those models, do you also think ahead in terms of the features that may come to you as a surprise? Because when we rely so much on statistical probabilities, right, pretty much the assumptions are closer to the knowns versus the unknowns. And when we talk more about human insight, we're looking at the stores where we are actually analyzing behavior, like tests from sentimental structures. What have you guys seen so far in the model, given the fact that your baseline is on source, or open source, as we said?
So there's sort of a couple of different ways of modeling that I should clarify here. There's statistical modeling, where you're trying to identify features that you observe in some phenomenon, some text, for example, and how those correlate with other activities or actions. You can see those correlations and develop a sort of statistical model around those. But on the other hand, there's also a theoretical model, and that's a lot of what Bentley's been talking about in the paper we discussed. And that one, it's a bit of a different story. You know, he said you want human eyeballs on this, and the reason is you want to make sure that your assumptions do, you know, make sense. They do match reality. That your model is using the latest and greatest. At least in our case, we wanted to be on the cutting edge of considering not just, you know, static effects of some government policies, but dynamic effects, the effects on business formation and the like. But that's all. It's a theoretical exercise. So of course you want to consider what may come out in that theoretical exercise. What other problems should we be considering? And that's what modeling is all about in that case. The first case, yeah, we're looking at what other words, what other features in text, regulations, but also other documents matter. So it's not just counting restrictions, it's not just classifying, we're doing other approaches, things like clustering or topic modeling, where we're trying to identify other features in documents that matter. And where that goes, the sky's the limit, especially since we've open sourced it all, and hopefully others will build on what we're doing.
And finally, Patrick, if the audience here today or people watching online want to learn more about Regdata and QuantGov, where should they look?
You should go to regdata.org to learn about Regdata. QuantGov.org is about QuantGov. That I should add a little disclaimer that we're currently rebuilding the QuantGov website. It's just a beta website right now, so it's not the prettiest of websites, but it's got the programs. It's actually a platform that you can build on to do your own analysis, create your own data from your own documents. It's got all of our data sets that we've created. I mentioned some earlier, and as we, the state regulations, we have a database built on the Federal Register itself now. Yeah. Actually, it's pretty cool. A couple of other groups have already used that in some of their own work. So that's all at quantgov.org.
Great. Well, in addition, all three of these scholars have pages at the Mercatus Center's website where you can read their publications. After you've gotten your fill of Hoover Institution research papers, then and only then do I recommend that you check out that work. But again, I'm a big fan of all three of these scholars, and I appreciate you coming today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.